Welcome to the Barbell Strategy Podcast,
where we talk about coaching,
training,
and all things strength and conditioning
to help the fitness athlete,
CrossFitter, and the coach. Please share and enjoy.
So on previous podcasts, we've been talking about the different types of strength and the different qualities of strength that you need in CrossFit. It's not necessarily as clear cut as developing the absolute strength that you might need in powerlifting and weightlifting and those types of things. And one of the key differences within CrossFit is, we hear of terms like CrossFit is a strength sport until you are strong enough, and then it is an endurance sport once you are strong enough. And then I've heard another one, CrossFit is a endurance sport with strength and skill prerequisites, which I think is pretty spot on as well. So we have this endurance element within CrossFit, and I like to sort of think that once you're able to do something in CrossFit, you need to figure out how to do a lot of it, or you need to figure out how to do it under a lot of different fatigue inputs and in a lot of different situations. So today's conversation and what we're going to go over today is more centered around strength endurance. We're going to look at some of the types of workouts that you might come across, certain nuances within those workouts which make them a little bit different in terms of how we would develop them, and then we'll start to look at some of the different methods and sort of ideas around developing this and what that might actually look like in a training scenario. But what we will do to kick things off is we will kick things off with our strength endurance specialist, Sam, who is someone who tends to do pretty good at this type of stuff. So Sam, talk us through it.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think for me, I've always been sat more comfortably with the strength and endurance side of things than the absolute strength side of things. Whether that's, obviously there's lots of reasons that could be, whether that's to do more with like my training background, obviously doing a lot of bodybuilding, inevitably, if you're doing bodybuilding, there's that carryover into CrossFit, I think, from a strength and endurance perspective, because you get used to doing kind of high volume sets, maybe things like supersets as well, obviously sub-maximal loads, but with the short rest periods. And I think there's definitely something to be said for that being a reasonable background to getting into CrossFit and the where it can help you out when you're first getting into it. So that's how I kind of led into it. And then I think for me, the thing that I've always been quite good at, which I think is an important skill in CrossFit, like we say, with obviously your absolute strength only gets you so far, is being able to consistently do good size sets of movements, of weightlifting movements under fatigue in a Metcon. And I think when you are looking at a CrossFit competition weekend, when you look at the balance of workouts over that weekend, then that is a skill which is going to gain you more points on the leaderboard than a 1 rep max or a heavy complex on an Olympic lift, because generally that's going to come up in more workouts and make more of a difference to your overall score than those 1 rep maxes. I think the hard thing when you're working with athletes is that it's a harder thing to measure and not something that there is likely to set as a target. I think a lot of people will say, I want to clean and jerk 150 kilos or back squat 200 kilos a lot more readily than saying that they want to be able to clean and jerk 70 kilos for 3 sets of 10 with 30 seconds rest in between, or after doing a set of burpees in between or something like that, which is understandable because I think naturally, mentally and, from social media and whatever, it's that the 1 rep max clean and jerks are the thing that looks cool, sounds cool, everybody asks you. But actually, it's that grunt work, it's the barbell cycling, it's the strength endurance stuff that's going to separate you from a performance perspective from other people. And I think we're seeing that more and more as people get closer and closer in terms of their max lifts. I think when we first started competing, you would have the people who'd come from an Olympic weightlifting background who were significantly better than everybody else at Olympic weightlifting. And on the flip side of that, you'd have someone like me who was a bodybuilder who could just pretty much reverse curl a clean and then push press a jerk. And obviously I was a long way from where that Olympic weightlifter was in terms of numbers. Whereas I think as CrossFit's developed as a sport, As people have had chance to develop their technique, and as coaches have got better at coaching Olympic weightlifting in a CrossFit setting, then obviously that gap is narrowed. And now if you look at on an elite level or in any competition now, there tends to be certain numbers in certain divisions, whether you're looking at intermediate, RX, elite, games, that people congregate around. And once you're at that number, it becomes more about how good are you at doing this percentage of that number repeatedly after you've just done a set of burpees and a set of bar muscle ups. And I think that's definitely a focus that people need to think about a little bit more.
Yeah, this is definitely, well, this is something, I'm the complete opposite. This is something I really struggled with. I'll talk a little bit later on about some of the training that I did and some of the things that, the sort of coach who really helped me out with it, some of the things he trialed with it, but it's it can be quite confusing because when you are early in your strength development, building your absolute strength will raise the ceiling for strength endurance, and it's not as clear cut as working absolute strength through this rep range and strength endurance through this rep range, etc. You just by generally building your strength and your capacity, doing those two things allows you to get better. And there's obviously an easy, quick learning curve. The first few times that you're exposed to something, right? The first time you do DT, it kicks you in the ass. The second time, you're probably able to knock a couple of minutes off because you're just right. I'm not gonna make that mistake. So this is something I would say that starts to come about more so when you're in that intermediate phase. It's something where you might start to notice certain types of workouts are really challenging you. It might be that you are able to, show off more strength than others when it comes to 1 rep maxes, but they're just able to rep out other weights. And there's just sort of, a trade-off, I think, after you get to a certain point. Does getting your back squat up, and I'm going to talk sort of on men's weights here, but once you get to let's say a 180 back squat and you're, like an intermediate, sort of a little bit more into that advanced stage, is it better for you, what's the energy to get your back squat to 200 kilos versus, actually just developing your strength endurance in more sport specific settings? So I think that's something which people need to think about as well. It's, you obviously have a good rate of return from developing your absolute strength early on, but then that will, and you start to learn that quite quickly at certain stages. What we're going to do now is we're going to cover just, I suppose, the different types of workouts that you might come across, because we talk about absolute strength, and that can be expressed with a 1 rep max clean, that can be expressed with a 1 rep max deadlift, and those can look quite different, the speed of movements and that type of stuff. And I think the same sort of exists within, we're going to call it the sort of strength endurance categories of workouts. So a couple of that sort of come to mind. One is more of this battery style workout, and this is something that I learned through OPEX, and it's just this, you could say it's more of an explosive movement. Usually this is going to be singles in terms of your weightlifting movements. And if you sort of think about when you're playing a computer game and you expend some energy or something like that, you're doing a car driving thing or whatever, and you've got the button that gives you the NOS or something like that, and then you hit the red, and then it's about sort of recharging that battery. And you could say that this is what we're looking at on these types of workouts. It's the cleans that you're able to do every 10 seconds or every 12 seconds. So that's one style of it. And one workout that I was given back in the day that I would say sort of highlights this was the test that I think some people are more familiar with in the coaching world is, the 1 rep max power clean. I think and then immediately move into a AMRAP at 80%, working an AMRAP for 8 minutes at 90% of your max. And that second part, that 8 minute AMRAP, is testing your battery. Another one I did was 30 power cleans at 45% of my max, 30 power cleans at 65%, and then an AMRAP at 85% in a 10-minute window. And then if you can sort of think of Isabel as a workout for someone of a certain strength capacity, that would be considered, I would say, more of this sort of battery style workout. You could say certain things like Amanda as well. Then the flip side of that would be, you could say things which are a little bit more high tension. And one that comes to mind, and a workout that I completely shit the bed on, was, I think it was 14.3. Still made it to regionals, but it was it was an 8-minute AMRAP, 10 deadlifts, 15 box jumps, 15 deadlifts, 15 box jumps, and then you continue adding 5 reps onto the deadlifts, and the deadlifts went from 135 to 365, and you obviously get into that heavier bar, 365, 225 on the women's side, whilst you've done all of that work beforehand. And I remember this was just my worst nightmare of a workout. I remember literally several people within the gym who were just doing classes beating me on this workout, but I managed to do better, okay on the other ones. But it's just sort of this high tension, having to hold on to a deadlift, building up a lot of fatigue. It's quite, you could say, like aerobic in sort of how it feels in terms of the movements you're going through. Lots of box jump step downs. You're going to get to those heavier barbells. Your grip is going to be fried. Your back is going to be toast. So in that sense, it's a little bit different to these workouts where you're doing heavier, you could call it barbell cycling, where you're working sort of more on a clock. And then another one would be 15.3, which was an 8-minute AMRAP again, and it was 3 handstand push-ups, 3 cleans at 185, 225, and then every round you'd increase the handstand push-ups, so you're adding 3 reps onto it, and then every 3 rounds you were increasing the weight on the power cleans. Now, if you think about that and just sort of like the pairing of it, I've actually put people through that as a workout, as like a bit of a test, using strict handstand push-ups. And then that in itself is a bit of a strength endurance test, you could say, because if we're thinking about, for some people, their capability on strict handstand push-ups, although it is gymnastics, it has sort of like this similar effect in terms of how you have to break movements up, how you have to approach movements to some of these more like heavier barbell movements. An easy one, like, some people, if they are limited in their, like someone might be working on their strict pull-ups. This is just, a little segue relating it back to some gymnastics. Let's say they got 5 strict pull-ups, and then they get a bit frustrated because their strict pull-up capacity just seems a little bit different each day. And if we say, okay, well, what's your 5 rep max back squat? And they're like, okay, it's this. And I'm like, could you hit that every day? Like, and then they're sort of, then they're not completely the same, but sometimes that can be like a good way of framing it as well. So with the more strict gymnastics type stuff, this is also something which I would say is like more battery oriented as well. And a final point with this type of work is that sometimes time isn't necessarily the thing that will allow you to do more. So it's not necessarily about resting more. It's not about breaking things up in a different way. Sometimes people just end up having like this, it's almost like this just limit, whether it's X amount of reps or whether it's working for a certain duration of time. And then the body just sends this response, this sort of fatigue response where everything like shuts down. It's almost like if you think of, you're trying to grind out a heavy deadlift, it's in the middle of a workout, it's say 80 to 85%, and you're trying to grind that that weight out. You've done all of that work beforehand. Sometimes those you might get to those points in a workout where it's not just about resting for another extra 15 seconds. Like you just sort of at a roadblock, and I think that's something people find difficult to get their heads around, because with other movements you can sort of rest your way to just being able to do more. And I've actually experienced this on like a number of times with legless rope climbs. Like as a movement, it's like, okay, there's a big strength demand there, and I would for it was like a number of competitions in a row. It was like I would just get to a certain amount of reps where I was like, okay, you're done. That's it. You're done. Like, and I'd try to hang from the rope, and it was even that wasn't working. So I think that sometimes it can be a bit complicated in terms of like how you have to work around it, and it really involves being quite creative in terms of how to create training progressions to get people working through this.
Hey everyone, Matt Harvey here. I produced this podcast that you're listening to or watching just now, so if you like the way that it looks and sounds, that's partially down to me. If you've got a podcast, video, or other online project that you'd like some production help with, or even if you just want to chat through some ideas, drop me a DM or an email. My details can be found in the show notes below. Thanks so much for your time. On with the show.
No, definitely. I mean, I think obviously there's an interesting comparison there between strength and endurance in something like Olympic lifts and then a movement like a deadlift. Because obviously with Olympic lifts, when you're doing them in a workout, and you can look at it and you can test it, and this is one of the big things I think with workout like strategy, depending on the load. Sometimes with Olympic lifts, you're just as fast just going for, say, single reps from the start than trying to do, say, touch and go sets, having to rest longer and trying to repeat that. Whereas I think with something like a deadlift, the nature of the movement tends to lend itself to the people who can do reasonable size sets consecutively with a short rest, because I think on Olympic lift, you gain more by dropping the bar each time in terms of what you're saving in terms of grip and like the eccentric loading. So I think that's definitely one thing to consider. And then obviously, like you say, then thinking about upper body movements, for me, it's probably more something like a strict handstand push-up. Like that would be a weaker movement for me, where after, say, so many reps in a workout, if there wasn't enough rest in between, or if there was a lot of conflict and movements in there, then I would hit a wall with that. I think with the workouts, you could probably even go a little bit further with it and think, if you take a workout, for example, I can't remember what year it was either 20 or 21, and it was 1 up to 10 and 10 down to 1 of deadlifts and burpees.
21,
yeah. And obviously there you've got, compared to the workout in 2014, which I loved, I think I came like third in Europe on that one, you know. Just get that in there. Obviously the deadlifts are a lot lighter, but your heart rate tends to be higher because you can't really breathe on the burpees in the same way you can on the box jumps. So I think really when you're looking at developing an all-round athlete in regards to strength and endurance, it's looking at Olympic lifts versus more like high tension movements, and then looking at the varying loads and being able to work across as many of those loads as possible to a high level. And I think that's the real skill, or the real thing that we're aiming for.
Yeah, because you do have someone who could demonstrate really good strength and endurance in a certain workout setting, but then it might be just a change of movement, because there's a skill element to it as well. And then also you could say just different archetypes of individuals. So I would say, you know, those sort of those athletes who, you know, they just do generally better at like hinging and pulling based movements and that type of stuff, sometimes a little bit taller and that type of thing, they will do well on your, you know, the deadlift box jump one, or I think, you know, the back in regionals back in the day, it was like 21.59, 315 deadlift. Box jumps are 30, right? That compared to the individual who, you know, like I think it was regionals 2014, it was like front squats and a strict hand. Is it strict handstand push-ups?
Yeah, it was like I think it was 21.18. It went down.
Yeah. So,
and it was I'm sure the front squats were like 90 kilos with strict handstand push-ups.
Yeah. So for me, I was like, that was good for me, because I mean, levers, short levers, and that type of stuff. Mate, I beat a couple of people who made it to the games and that workout. Anyway, shit the bed on the next one on the rope climbs, though. But you got to take into consideration like movement archetypes, and for those people who only know us via the podcast, Sam and I, very different shapes and sizes, you know, but we also lends ourselves to doing better at different things in CrossFit.
We should have done a pairs comp at some point. Hey, we missed out. We could have balanced each other out quite well.
2-person worm, you'd be doing all the work. Right?
Yeah, I would have been anyway. Hey, you can just do the weightlifting.
Yeah, but I think when it comes to these types of workouts, I will just say it can be like a few things which they're just more anecdotal experience that I think can be quite good to sort of lean on is, when you're thinking about developing your deadlift and that type of stuff, I think sometimes it pays it a little bit better for you to be good at multiple heavy deadlifts. I think that it's just the way it's tested in CrossFit, and I think just from logistically, it's easier to load up a heavy bar and just have it on the floor and people to do deadlifts with it rather than like expecting some technical movement in a competition, that type of stuff. And then if we're thinking about like, movement patterns per se, if we're thinking about squatting, the types of sort of squatting strength endurance that you need, generally it's going to be lended more to Olympic weightlifting, right? Heavy squat cleans, repeated reps, that type of stuff. And then in those situations, you're looking at, can you sort of do that drop and go, recharge the battery quite quickly, and that type of stuff. And those are things that I just think, I don't necessarily have any hard data on it or anything like that, but I've gone through this myself. I've seen other people I've trained with go through it as well. And I've also worked with, with athletes where I've been helping them. But like, there are certain things that you want to be able to do. And like we sort of mentioned on a previous podcast, like if you're not clean and jerking X amount of weight and you want to make it to what was semi-final regional type level, I think another one could be like, if you're not able to hit 30 squat cleans at 100 kilos in like a decent time, like those are the type of things you actually need to think about. It's not what's your 10 rep max, what's your 20 rep max of this. It's like no, can you just rep out this barbell with this movement for time, and I remember when I worked with one coach in particular who really did push my strength endurance, some of the little benchmark tests that we did were 100 kilo squat cleans, 30 reps per time, and then I think it was a 5-minute AMRAP deadlifts at like 315, so 143 kilos, and those were things that we just trained for through different means and everything like that. But it was so I think when you are looking at these types of workouts and stuff, it's probably better just to look at the workouts as they were and try to almost think about, okay, well, where would an athlete trip up on this and on that, rather than thinking about it from like how you may typically see strength development, where you're trying to develop your deadlift and your squat and your bench press and your strict press and push press or whatever on sort of more like equal terms. It's more like what is actually being asked of you in the sport. Let's work on that. And I think one of the things as well we haven't really mentioned is some of the odd object type stuff, like sandbag cleans. That's just like that's a movement that comes in these days, and that like body weight really is like something which can affect that quite dramatically. And I think it's more just because, with a barbell you can sort of figure your way around it and get your technique, whereas with a big object, if you are bigger and you're able just to move that mass, it's going to be a lot easier. And we see now as well the type of athlete who's at the elite level, like they look very different to what it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, 100%. I think the other object stuff is an interesting one, because I think as well it's how people think about it. It's the kind of thing that will come up in a competition and people panic train it for 2 weeks beforehand, as opposed to being something that they might use as a training tool all year round. And it's finding the right balance with things like that as to how much to do it and then what to do with it. Because I think there's certain things in there that have a lot of carryover, and certain things that are perhaps a little bit more specific that they might have chosen to use in a competition, but you're never really going to use it outside of that competition. And I think obviously sandbags are a great one for their flexibility in terms of the range of different movements that you can do with them. And I think there is a lot of carryover for something like that. But then obviously, then you might see other things. I think like something like a yoke is a great one, but the trouble for most CrossFitters is accessibility, and it's something that very rarely comes up.
Yeah.
So then when you're planning their training, you obviously, again, if you're talking about making it specific to the demands of what they're going to have to do, then you're more likely to use something like a sandbag hay. So I think that's an interesting one. I think the thing when you're thinking about developing strength and endurance is it's a relatively especially not even just within CrossFit, but generally, when you think of endurance from an aerobic or anaerobic perspective, and then you think of absolute strength, there's a lot of research. Do you know what I mean? You can go and find loads of research from different sports and different settings, and then you can take the best of it and apply it to CrossFit. Whereas I think strength endurance stuff, it's a little bit more limited, which in some ways I think is quite good because it gives you more room for experimentation and you can play around and see what works. But then equally, you do then have to figure things out, and there is an element of trial and error in there.
Yeah, it's not as clear cut as having a max day and a speed day and this, and having lots of different programs of, you know.
Exactly, and then so I think that combined as well with, it's a bit of a moving target, because obviously absolute strength is the 1 rep max. Endurance, you might use a row test or something like that. Whereas strength endurance, it's because there's that range of different loads, if you think about it percentage wise, that you need to be able to move efficiently in different ways, in different combinations. It's how much breadth can we get on this and still be efficient in your training, because obviously we can't do everything in your training all at once.
Yeah, I think like you said, you've got maybe not as many tried and tested methods with this type of stuff, but if you do take the principles from strength development and then from endurance development, and then you start to sort of blend it, you could say, within more of a CrossFit-y type setting, like that's where this type of stuff can sort of work. What I've tried to do is put together just like maybe a few different examples of stuff, and then Sam, maybe you can just like throw in your sort of 2 cents. But I think if you think of it from, let's say, accumulation to intensification, I think that's generally a good way of trying to sort of organize and structure the development things. So with accumulation, we're thinking about things like volume, increasing the density, so reducing the amount of, or increasing the amount of work that you're doing within a certain time. And I also think within this, also confidence is a big one, because it's a little bit more qualitative, you could say, but that's definitely going to be something which, once you start to just do the work and do it more and more, and you get more familiar with the barbell at a certain weight in certain environments and that type of thing, then those types of things, I think they do actually end up having a really positive effect, especially if someone struggles with this type of stuff, because they could be very hyper aware of like not blowing up, and I've definitely been that. I was very hyper aware of it, and I'll be way too conservative, and then going through that volume accumulation is something which helped out. Intensification, this is what you'd be going through after. We're thinking doing things heavier, doing things which are harder, so that could be doing things at harder paces, or it could be making the movement more complex, and then also interference. So we're thinking about adding in other elements which may be making the environment a bit more chaotic. It could be starting off with pairings of movements that work well together, like let's say assault bike and deadlift, and then moving into things like row and deadlift, where you actually start to get a little bit more interference in terms of like the movement patterns you're going through. And the way this could actually sort of look, on paper, it could be you're starting off with EMOMs, just EMOMs of, a barbell movement at a certain weight range for a certain amount of reps. And then you got EMOMs with machines. So it could be doing your EMOM and then jumping onto a bike easy between, like a zone 2 effort. And then you start to increase the efforts that you're going on the machines. And then you're thinking about putting it into a simple Metcon, putting it into, with movements which aren't going to be detracting from the exercise too much. You're still able to build on that confidence. And then you're starting to think about movements that might be a bit more competitive, like some of the pairings that we see. Typical one is being inverted and doing some form of deadlifting. It's typical one would be, let's say thrusters and some form of upper body pulling. And then more and more and more, you're adding in chaos, you're making it harder. And this is where, your workouts or your progressions can start off in a very structured way. and then they can start to just move into things that just look more progressively like the sport. And you might have a workout which you want to work on, and you have that as the end goal, and then you sort of say, okay, well, where's this athlete right now? What is their limiter in that workout? Is it the length of the workout? Is it the energy demands, or is it the weight on the bar? And then you're able to specify the training in order to give them like what they need for that end goal workout.
No, definitely. And I think within that as well, there's a space for working on different variations of a movement for the different loads required in that workout. So like say for me, if I'm looking at developing someone's barbell cycling, I'll get them to spend some time where they might be doing muscle snatches or muscle cleans. More muscle snatches and muscle cleans because I think you use that more, but get used to doing light loads, muscle snatches, high volume, and not be scared of that. Because I think a lot of it is confidence. I think a little bit like what you were saying, especially when people are in that intermediate stage, if they're the kind of person who adds up how many reps they might have to do with something, they can get a little bit overwhelmed by it. And if you say to someone, yeah, this workout's got 100 deadlifts in it, they can panic, or 100 power snatches, they can panic. And it's a case of getting them comfortable with those kind of volumes and it not even being a thing. So then obviously going back to the snatches, then I might look at things more like, say, no feet power snatches. So perhaps a little bit more efficient than a muscle snatch, but time-wise not too dissimilar. And then you might go for full power snatches. And I'll work people through a progression of all those different variations so that depending on the workout, they go, okay, this workout, this weight, I'm going to do this. Or even when you get the smart athletes, it'll be like, for the first 5 rounds, I'm going to do this. And then as I get tired, I'm going to change to this. And it's being able to have that ability to adapt on the fly when they're fatigued between those different movement styles. I think the other thing that I like to do, I'm not sure the people I coach love it, but when it comes to like interference, I'll be quite aggressive with how specific that interference might be. It depends on the progression they're working through, where they're at with it, and how close they are to a competition. But obviously in a CrossFit workout, the interference tends to come from, like you say, deadlifts and rowing, for example, or being inverted or all that kind of stuff. Whereas for me, I might, if they're kind of mid-phase with this, I might think, all right, I'm going to get you to do some assault bike into some jumping lunges into your back squats. So the interference is very, very localized, and look at building that strength and endurance in a very specific way with something like that. Within that as well, I might play around with exactly how that's broken up. So the volume might be the same. It might be 50 reps of back squats at a load of around 70% accumulated, but how I'll accumulate that volume might be a little bit different. So you might have a session like, say, that one where you've gone assault bike, lunges, 10 back squats. Other times I'll just say 50 back squats. Every time you break, you're going to do this, this, and this. So again, then they get used to playing around with what feels right in terms of where they can push to with rep ranges. Yeah. And they find their limits because they know, all right, the first set I did 15, but then I was doing sets of 3 from there on out. And I think, there's obviously a different kind of stimulus that they get from that, but then there's also then the learning that they get from that in terms of managing themselves and understanding what it feels like before they hit that complete wall of muscular fatigue. So that's something I like to vary up at different stages. Yeah. And progress.
So one of the ways that I think can be quite good is also, and this is a lot less direct and aggressive, but this would be maybe looking at things more from just this is far away from competition. This is not trying to make it hard. This might be with someone who really needs to develop their confidence, but you can flip that as well. So, because what you're sort of saying is you start off with, let's say, cyclical, going into like, more regional, like local muscle endurance-y, and then you're going into your hard contractions. Well, so what I suppose you're trying to do there, right, is you're trying to focus on that end work. Like, how can we get to that end work and be as fresh as possible, and how do we fucking manage being there? Another way is you start off with the end work and then you sort of work your way down. And I think at regionals, maybe a number of years ago, it was like they did a workout, and I think it was they started to play around with descending weight for the first time. And I think for a lot of people that was like, whoa, what? Because usually we think about workouts, we're thinking the bar gets heavier, and sometimes they even add reps onto it, right? Like, so what's this about making it get easier? And in that situation, it might start off and it's like a workout where it's really, grindy, you're doing drop and goes, and then eventually you get into the end of it where you're able to start like, putting some touch and go reps together using faster cycle rates. But the idea when you're thinking about these types of training progressions, it could be rather than building up all the work and then trying to make the intense stuff harder, it's like try to build up as much volume as you can around that work and intensity. And I'm going to give you an endurance example. So let's say you've got 30 on, 30 off as hard as you can for 5 minutes. After that, you go directly into 5 minutes of zone 2. Then you go into 5 minutes 30 on, 30 off, and you cycle through that for half an hour. And then the progression, rather than trying to increase the amount of 30 on, 30 off, is you just basically, you try to keep those in the intensity high on that 30 on, 30 off. You try to even push a little bit more if you've got it in you, like obviously staying within some RPE limitations. But the in-between work, the zone 2 in-between work, is the stuff that you actually extend. So it could be 5 minutes into 7, into 5, into 7, and then after that it's 5 into 10, and then that way you're increasing the amount of work that you're able to do whilst also still being able to express the intensity that you want. And one of the things I've tried to do with that in relation to strength endurance is it's a little bit like German body composition training, where I think it was like 6 reps of something heavy into 12 reps of something. And then the movements, this is like a Poliquin style. It would start off like maybe it would be like 6 back squats into 12 heavy lunges into 24 light leg extensions or some shit like that for your quads. But you could do the same with some CrossFit workouts as well. It could be going heavy deadlifts into, some heavy sandbag laps, which is like a sandbag deadlift type thing, into light kettlebell swings, and then you have like a bit more of a muscle endurance flavor onto the workout. But I think that general ideas around endurance of just trying to find ways of increasing the amount of work that you do and getting creative with it, start off, increase the amount of aerobic work and cyclical stuff they're able to do around these heavy exposures, then move into stuff which is potentially harder as well.
Definitely. I mean, at the end of the day, with strength stuff like this, the volume intensity is very easy to measure and manipulate, isn't it? So you can play around with combinations with it, just like you would with endurance training. I think sometimes it's a case of, a little bit like what we spoke about last time, it's a case of how complicated do I need to make this for this particular person if it's something they've never done before. You can keep it quite simple in those kind of settings. And then as well, it's like, okay, well, how creative do we want to get? Because at the end of the day, in a competition, you never exactly know what they are going to be exposed to. So if you take as broad of an approach as possible in terms of exposing them to as many different variations as possible, in a way that you can still measure that volume and intensity and you can still progress it, then I think that benefits them in terms of both confidence and engagement. But also it's going to help prepare them for a competition where you just don't know what's going to happen. And I think I quite enjoy this kind of training. The other thing as well with it, which is quite interesting and again links back to what we were talking about before, is you see some people and they'll go through a phase like this and they'll be stronger than if they'd have done a more pure strength cycle. Yeah,
this is what we were saying in a previous podcast about like not being able to be so precise with the adaptations and the results that because people respond differently, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm not 100% sure of like the actual, it might be a little bit off here, but generally speaking, if we look at like men and women and the differences in sort of strength expression and that type of stuff, and we look at just open workouts and this type of thing as well, generally women are doing better on the strength endurance side than men are, or like if we're sort of making a like for like, And part of that also just comes down to, I think, if we think of like people's like essence and all this type of stuff, like I think sometimes the people can be quite explosive, and that can actually not serve them too well in these scenarios. And if we look at, like, I think there was a games athlete back in the day, what's his name? I think it was Jeff someone. Anyway, he was like the strong guy of the games in like 2013, 2014. And he was getting coached at Invictus, and apparently he used to just have to do like 60 minutes of steady state cardio in the morning in some form or another to actually dampen him, to actually like bring him into a bit more of a fatigued state, so he doesn't blow up from a workout where he's got to do, squat cleans at 100 kilos or something like that. So I think that's something to, little side note there. But I remember you can get super creative with this type of work. I remember one time, like my previous coach who helped me with this, he gave me a workout once. It was like 20 minutes, 500 meter row at like an RPE 8. And then it was go in and do 3 to 5 back squats at like 140 kilos. And then it was back on the row, and then it was into, some legless row climbs. And I was thinking to myself, like, what the hell? Some back squats, heavy back squats in the middle of a Metcon? But it was actually something, and I asked him why, and he was like, yeah, I just want you to be able, just get used to like moving a heavy barbell whilst being like out of breath a little bit. I was like, all right, cool. And you literally, with this type of thing, you can make a justification behind it, which is as simple as that. It doesn't have to have some fancy scientific, lens to it. It can be as simple as you just need to get better at doing this thing and operating and managing it whilst you're a little bit tired.
No, definitely. I think as well, though, people, it's looking at that transfer over, because you might not necessarily have back squats in a workout, but how many squatting movements do we have in the CrossFit competition?
But like, if you're thinking of someone who's like more advanced as well, like it's stimulus, right? You can be specific with it, but they've probably done enough specific stuff to. Yeah.
That's it. So it's just exposing them to that. I think the other thing with it is just taking away that, like I say, that fear of repping out heavy loads with people, giving them the confidence to be able to do it, but also so they know how it's going to feel. Because I think some people, especially people newer perhaps, or not even newer, but some people will pace to the point where they never feel what that muscular fatigue feels like, or they just fatigue so quickly aerobically they're never challenging the muscular fatigue. And but then equally, then you get people on the flip side where their muscular fatigue kicks in so early on that they never feel that aerobically challenged, and that's when I think you have to identify the limitations of the person that you're working with, and then use this to help break through that and take that slightly more specific approach, which might be different to someone else and might seem a little bit like counterintuitive to what they then actually, or what people see when people go out and do a workout,
Yeah, like we won't get into it now, but have you ever come across Evan Pycon's work on like delivery, respiration and utilization limitations?
I've not heard of him, but I can kind of get the gist of where you're going with it.
The easiest way you can explain it is you get some people who might be like very aerobically fit, but they will just do a certain amount of contractions of a certain movement, and then all of a sudden they get blood occlusions in a certain area of their body, and then in that situation it's not necessarily just a case of like increasing the intensity of the workout, because they need to be able to learn how to work through that, and be able to manage the energy demands of those particular workouts. But definitely beyond the scope of this podcast. But I think what we'll do is, as just sort of finish off with, you add in any points that you might have. There's a couple of things I think that is good to generally not do or do. So I think first one is, don't be trying to do this type of stuff and develop this type of stuff extensively while also trying to develop other strength qualities. I just don't think it's going to happen. Just pick one or the other if you are going to be trying to work through one quite a bit. So you can obviously be doing several things at the same time in terms of, you know, a training week or something like that. But if you really have a big focus for a training block on strength endurance, you don't need to be trying to develop your absolute strength at the same time, because it's going to be very difficult for you to do that. The other thing as well, and I think if you have people who, Sam touched on it a little bit with, like, they might need a bit of exposure to stuff. They might need to just feel what it's like, especially with people who are very cautious as athletes. But I also think that sometimes, you know, like, if they've had the exposure to it and you're earlier on in your work on this type of stuff, I think it is very important just to encourage that you don't create training that just blows people up. So if they are only just starting to get to grips with this type of thing, a big thing is the confidence element of it. It's getting them to just be able to handle just a little bit more each week, be able to actually visibly see that in their workouts, right? Don't be doing a different bloody progression every single week. Like, if they actually start to see that, they start to build a bit of momentum. And then once they've got that momentum and they feel like they're a bit, you know, more confident with that type of thing, that's going to be when you would start to implement some of the things that Sam was referring to, where you're actually like, oh, no, the point is for you to actually work to failure and understand what this feels like and be like okay with managing it, because that's also part of training. Part of training is just like learning to go where you know you shouldn't go in a competition and just stay below that red line. So you've got to explore this stuff, and sometimes you've got to touch the fire. But I think when you are working with someone who's super cautious and they have a tendency of blowing up, it's like, don't be too aggressive with this type of thing. You can do training which it doesn't necessarily feel easy, but it might feel a bit easier than what you would see in a typical CrossFit Metcon. Like, people will go through DT and they will be dying, and then they will go through training progressions for this type of stuff, and they'll come away from it and they'll feel like, okay. And that's good, because the goal with maybe a progression like this is to be able to accumulate 10 rounds of DT with also doing a bunch of other work. And for you to be able to do that in the early stages, it's like you do need to keep the intensity at a point where it's fairly manageable.
Definitely. And I think the other thing with it is it's doing it with the right people at the right time. And like what we were saying before as well on the previous podcast, it doesn't have to be complicated straight away.
Yeah.
You know, we can start off almost taking a bodybuilding approach, keep it super simple, do high volume sets, higher volume than you might be used to with short rest periods. Keep it as simple as that. And then equally, you might then throw in something like, say, drop sets. Again, it's relatively simple. It's a little bit safer. They're under control, and they can start off with that and then go from there. And I think also as well, like, say, beginners, they're getting enough of that from their normal, say, Metcons, that they perhaps don't need to do any extra stuff. It's only when you get into this more advanced level and we're talking about smaller margins that this kind of stuff really kind of kicks in and makes a difference.
All right, we're going to finish up there. Thank you very much for tuning in. Make sure you guys share this with your training buddies, with your coaching buddies, and give us 5 stars wherever you listen, and subscribe to our YouTube.